In the spring of 1987, 10 men were found scattered across the hills of McDowell County, West Virginia. Each one had been eliminated with surgical precision. Each one had a connection to a fire that destroyed a family farm 3 years earlier, and each one had underestimated a 62-year-old widow named Eleanor Price. This is the story of how a quiet woman who spent her entire life raising cattle in the Appalachian Mountains became one of the most methodical executioners in American rural history. This is the story of patience, of loss, of justice denied, and of a revenge so calculated that even the FBI called it one of the most organized acts of vigilante violence ever investigated. To understand what Eleanor did in 1987, we need to go back to 1984. We need to understand what was taken from her and why the law failed her so completely that she decided to become the law herself. McDowell County was once the heart of American coal. In its peak years, the mines drew thousands of workers from across the country, turning small mountain towns into bustling centers of industry and ambition. But by the early 1980s, that era was over. The mines had closed one by one, the jobs had vanished, and the people who remained were those who had nowhere else to go, or those who refused to abandon the land their families had worked for generations. Eleanor Price was one of the latter. She was born Eleanor Mason in 1925, the youngest daughter of a farming family that had lived on Sycamore Ridge since before the Civil War. Her father raised cattle, her mother preserved vegetables, her brothers worked the fields until the war took 2 of them and the mines took the 3rd. By the time Eleanor was 20, she was the only one left to inherit the farm. She married Harold Price in 1947. He was a quiet man from a neighboring county, a carpenter by trade, gentle by nature. They built their life together on that ridge, expanding the farmhouse room by room, raising 3 children, and tending to a herd of cattle that eventually numbered over 60 head. It was not a wealthy life, but it was stable. It was theirs. Harold passed away in 1979 from a heart condition. Their eldest son, Thomas, had moved to Ohio for work. Their daughter, Mary, had married and settled in Virginia. Their youngest son, Daniel, stayed on the farm to help his mother. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and devoted to the land. By 1984, Eleanor was 59 years old, a widow managing a farm with her son, living a life that had become routine and predictable. She woke before dawn, fed the animals, checked the fences, cooked, prayed, and slept. She had no enemies, she had no conflicts, she had no reason to believe that anyone would want to harm her. But in McDowell County, in those desperate years, land had become valuable in ways that had nothing to do with farming. There was a man named Vernon Cordell, who had spent the previous decade buying up distressed properties across the county. He was not interested in farming. He was interested in mineral rights, in timber, in the possibility that the government might one day build a highway through the region. Vernon had accumulated over 3,000 acres by 1984, most of it purchased from families who had no choice but to sell. Eleanor's farm sat on 240 acres of prime ridge land. It had water access, timber, and a clear title going back over a century. Vernon had approached her twice about selling. Both times she had refused. The first time, in 1982, she had been polite. She told him the land was not for sale, that it had been in her family for generations, and that she intended to pass it to her children. The second time, in early 1984, he had been less cordial. He told her that the county was changing, that a woman her age could not manage a farm alone, and that she would be wise to take his offer before circumstances made the decision for her. Eleanor looked at him with the same steady gaze she used. When facing down a stubborn bull, she told him to leave her property and not to return. Vernon Cordell was not a man who accepted rejection gracefully. He had connections throughout the county, including relationships with local officials and a network of men willing to do unpleasant work for the right price. In the weeks following her refusal, strange things began to happen on her property. Fences were cut, gates were left open, cattle wandered onto neighboring land, equipment malfunctioned, tools disappeared. Daniel told his mother they should report the incidents to the sheriff. They made 3 separate complaints over the following months. Each time, a deputy came, took notes, and promised to investigate. Each time, nothing happened. The harassment continued. On the night of September 14th, 1984, Eleanor and Daniel had dinner together in the farmhouse kitchen. They talked about the upcoming cattle auction, about repairs that needed to be made to the barn roof. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way. She woke to the smell of smoke. The barn was already engulfed when she reached the window. Flames climbed 50 feet into the night sky, turning the darkness orange. She could hear the cattle screaming. She ran outside, calling for Daniel, but he was already running toward the barn, trying to open the gates, trying to free the animals. The heat was impossible. The smoke was blinding. Eleanor watched her son disappear into that inferno, and she never saw him. Alive again. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, there was nothing left to save. 43 cattle perished. The barn was reduced to ash, and Daniel Price, 31 years old, was found near the collapsed entrance, overcome by smoke. The official cause of the fire was listed as electrical malfunction. Eleanor knew it was arson. She knew it in her bones, but proving it was another matter entirely. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. The county fire marshal examined the scene and concluded that faulty wiring had sparked the blaze. There was no evidence of accelerants, he said, no evidence of foul play. Eleanor demanded a second opinion. She hired a private investigator with the little money she had saved. He found witnesses who had seen trucks on the road near her property that night, trucks that did not belong to anyone in the immediate area. He found rumors, whispers, and dead ends, but nothing that would hold up in court. Vernon Cordell made a third offer on the property, this time through an intermediary, suggesting that Eleanor might want to start fresh somewhere else after such a tragedy. She refused again. But something had changed in Eleanor Price. The woman who had spent her life accepting hardship with quiet faith, who had buried her husband and kept working, that woman was gone. In her place was something harder, something colder, something that had stopped waiting for justice and started planning for it. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are someone who appreciates stories of strength, perseverance, and justice in its rawest form, then you belong here. Subscribe now and activate notifications, because this story is only beginning, and what Eleanor did next will stay with you forever. Eleanor Price kept a journal. She had kept one since she was a girl, a habit her mother had instilled in her. After the fire, the nature of her entries changed. Names began to appear, dates, locations, connections. Over the course of 3 years, she compiled information on every man she believed was involved in the destruction of her farm and the loss of her son. The first name was Vernon Cordell himself. He was the architect, the man who wanted her land badly enough to take it by force. But Vernon was careful. He never did his own dirty work. The second name was Roy Mullins. He was 47 years old, a former miner who had worked for Vernon on various intimidation jobs. His truck had been seen near Sycamore Ridge on the night of the fire. The third name was Roy's brother Curtis Mullins. Curtis was 43, the planner who figured out how to do things without getting caught. The fourth name was Harlan Stacy, 39, a mechanic who operated a garage in Welch. Harlan had connections to Vernon through loans that left him permanently indebted. The fifth name was Earl Dean Compton, 51, a former deputy dismissed for misconduct. Eleanor believed he had ensured that the investigation went nowhere. The sixth name was Delbert Ray Owens, 29, a petty criminal who served as muscle for a few $100s and a case of liquor. The seventh name was Clyde Ramey, 44, a trucker who moved equipment and people when discretion was required. The eighth name was Boyd Sizemore, 53, who provided Vernon with information about holdout farmers who might be persuaded to sell. The ninth name was Junior Hatfield, 41, a drunk and gambler willing to sell his services to anyone who would pay. The 10th and final name was Wesley Cordill, 34, Vernon's nephew, seen buying gasoline the night of the fire at a station that should have been closed. 10 men, 10 names, 10 connections to the night that took everything from Eleanor Price. She did not rush. She did not make mistakes. For 3 years she watched and waited, confirming each connection, understanding each man's role, learning their patterns and their weaknesses. She attended funerals and church, services where these men appeared. She shopped at stores where they shopped. She listened to gossip at the diner. She became invisible, an old widow that no one paid attention to. She began acquiring weapons in 1985. She had always owned guns. Everyone in rural West Virginia did. But now she expanded her collection, purchasing firearms at estate sales, always paying cash. She practiced shooting in the back acres of her property. Her hands were steady, her eyesight was sharp, and her motivation never wavered. By early 1987, Eleanor Price was ready. She was 62 years old, a widow, a grandmother, a church-going woman that everyone had dismissed as defeated. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first man she approached was Boyd Sizemore, the informant. She found him alone at his property on a Tuesday afternoon. Boyd recognized her but showed no alarm. Why would he? She was an old woman, a victim of circumstances. Eleanor asked him directly if he had given Vernon Cordill information about her farm. Boyd's face went pale. He admitted that he had shared a few details, but claimed he had no idea what Vernon intended to do. He said he was sorry about what happened to her son, that Vernon had assured him it would just be property damage, a way to convince her to sell. Eleanor listened. Then she made her decision. Boyd Sizemore was found 2 days later by a hunter. The investigation went nowhere. Eleanor Price attended his funeral and sat in the back pew, her head bowed in prayer. After Boyd Sizemore's passing, the county experienced a period of nervous quiet. But the men on Eleanor's list knew something was wrong. They understood that Boyd had connections to certain activities. Vernon Cordill made discreet inquiries. Roy Mullins started carrying a weapon at all times. The others looked over their shoulders more often than before. Eleanor waited 2 months before acting again. Patience was her greatest weapon. Her second target was Delbert Ray Owens. He spent most of his evenings at a bar outside Welch, drinking until closing time, then driving home on back roads. Eleanor intercepted him on one of those roads in April. When she identified herself, his confusion turned to fear. He tried to apologize, to offer money, to promise testimony against Vernon, but Eleanor had already made her decision. Delbert Owens was found the next morning by a passing trucker. If you are watching this story and feeling the weight of Eleanor's choices, I want to ask you something. Take a moment right now and type in the comments, "The mountains remember," just those 3 words. Type them if you understand why Eleanor did what she did, even if you cannot say you would do the same. The next several months became a grim pattern. One by one, the men on Eleanor's list began to disappear or be found in circumstances that suggested violence. Harlan Stacy was discovered in his own garage, the victim of what appeared to be a robbery. Junior Hatfield vanished entirely. His truck found abandoned near the river, his body never recovered. Earl Dean Compton was found on a remote logging road. Clyde Ramey disappeared during one of his trucking runs. Each incident was treated as separate, unconnected. The sheriff's department did not have the resources or the imagination to see the pattern emerging, and Eleanor Price, who attended church every Sunday, was never once questioned. By August of 1987, 6 of the 10 men were gone. The remaining 4 had begun to understand that they were being hunted. Vernon Cordill hired private security. Roy and Curtis Mullins rarely left their property. Wesley Cordill started sleeping with a shotgun beside his bed. They discussed the situation in whispered conversations, trying to identify their enemy. They suspected rival land speculators, aggrieved family members of other people they had wronged, perhaps even law enforcement. Not once did they consider the 62-year-old widow. That was their fatal mistake. Eleanor began by isolating Roy Mullins. Roy's weakness was his pride. He hated the idea of hiding. After 2 months of confinement, he announced to his brother that he was going to town. Roy drove to Welch on a Saturday afternoon, alone. He stopped at the hardware store, the grocery, and the liquor store. He was proving to himself that he was not afraid. Eleanor followed him at a distance, waiting for the right moment. It came when Roy pulled off the main road. He stepped behind a thick stand of trees. He never saw her approach. Roy Mullins was found the following day. His pistol was still in his truck, unfired. Curtis Mullins broke down completely when he heard about his brother. He went to Vernon and confessed everything, begging Vernon to do something. Vernon made a decision. He contacted the state police and offered to provide information about the fire in exchange for protection. He was willing to sacrifice everyone, including his nephew, to save himself. But Vernon had waited too long. On September 12, 1987, exactly 3 years after the fire that took Daniel Price, Vernon Cordill was in his home office making phone calls. His security was posted outside, watching the driveway. Eleanor came through the back. Across 2 miles of timberland she had walked a dozen times. She entered through a basement window. She climbed the stairs in darkness. Vernon looked up from his desk to find a woman standing in his doorway. A woman he had dismissed and destroyed. A woman who had spent 3 years becoming the instrument of his end. She told him why she was there. She told him she knew everything. She told him Daniel had been a good son who never harmed anyone. Vernon tried to offer money. He tried to threaten her. His voice would not carry through the thick walls. Eleanor did not hurry. She had waited 3 years. She could wait a few more minutes. Vernon Cordill was discovered by his security team after several hours of silence. Eleanor attended church services the next morning as she always did. Wesley Cordill and Curtis Mullins were the last 2 names on Eleanor's list. After Vernon's death, they fled McDowell County. Wesley headed to Kentucky, Curtis to Virginia. Eleanor hired her private investigator to track them. Wesley was found first, living under a false name outside Lexington. He believed distance would protect him. He was wrong. Eleanor made the drive to Kentucky in October. She spent 2 days watching Wesley's patterns. Wesley Cordill's disappearance was reported after he failed to show up for work. His apartment was undisturbed. There were no witnesses. Curtis Mullins lasted longer. He had chosen a remote cabin in Virginia, but he wrote a letter to his sister explaining where he was. The letter was intercepted by someone who paid well for information. Eleanor received Curtis's location in December. In February, during a heavy snowstorm, she made her way to that cabin. Curtis Mullins was found a week later. With his passing, Eleanor Price had completed her list. 10 men were gone, but the FBI had begun to notice. Agent Marcus Webb had been reviewing unsolved cases across Appalachia. When he mapped the deaths, the connections became impossible to ignore. 10 men, all linked to a single property developer, all eliminated within 18 months. Agent Webb drove to McDowell County in March 1988. He reviewed the fire marshal's report and noted inconsistencies. He located Eleanor's private investigator. He learned about evidence that had been gathered but ignored. Then he visited Eleanor Price. She received him in her farmhouse kitchen, offering coffee. Agent Webb told her about the pattern of deaths. He told her he believed all 10 men had been involved in the fire, and he asked her if she knew anything. Eleanor told him about the night of the fire, about the investigation that went nowhere, about 3 years trying to find justice through proper channels. She told him the law had failed her, that the system had protected the men who destroyed her family. But she did not confess. She simply asked Agent Webb a question. If the law would not protect innocent people from men like Vernon Cordell, what were innocent people supposed to do? Wait, pray, watch as the men who had burned their children walked free. Agent Webb had no answer. He spent another week interviewing everyone who might have information. He found no physical evidence connecting Eleanor to any death. He found no witnesses. He found only a woman who had suffered an unimaginable loss and a community that had closed ranks around her. No charges were ever filed. Eleanor Price continued to live on Sycamore Ridge for another 12 years. She passed away peacefully in 2000 at the age of 75 and was buried beside her husband and son. Chapter 5. The community's silence. The people of McDowell County knew. Not everyone, and not with certainty, but enough of them suspected what Eleanor Price had done. They talked about it in low voices, at kitchen tables and church suppers. Some were horrified. They believed that violence was never justified, that Eleanor had damned her soul by taking matters into her own hands. But many others understood. They had seen what men like Vernon Cordell did to vulnerable families. They had watched the law look the other way when powerful people committed crimes. They knew the rage that lived beneath grief. The silence that protected Eleanor was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and communal. People who might have noticed her movements chose not to remember. People who might have spoken to investigators chose to forget. This was mountain justice, older than the state, a code that held some wrongs could only be righted by the wronged. The irony was not lost on those who knew the full story. Vernon had used that same silence to destroy Eleanor's farm. She had turned the system against him, using the same shadows, the same willingness of mountain people to mind their own business. Agent Webb wrote about the case after retirement. He called Eleanor one of the most disciplined individuals he had ever investigated. Most people who take the law into their own hands act on impulse. They make mistakes. Eleanor was different. She waited until her emotions had cooled into something harder. She planned every detail. She never rushed. Eleanor never spoke publicly about what she had done. She lived her final years in quiet routine. But those who knew her said there was a change after the last man was gone, a lightness, a peace. She told her daughter near the end that she had made her peace with God, that she had done what needed to be done. Her daughter never asked for details. She simply held her mother's hand. Eleanor was buried on a spring morning with the dogwoods blooming and the mountains rising green around the cemetery. The preacher spoke about forgiveness. The neighbors said nothing about the 10 men. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Sycamore Ridge. 20 years after Eleanor's death, a documentary filmmaker came to McDowell County researching stories of Appalachian resilience. She interviewed dozens of people. She spoke with Eleanor's daughter, who confirmed the fire, but would say nothing about what followed. She found Agent Webb, now in his 80s. He told her Eleanor was, in his professional opinion, one of the most effective vigilantes in American history, not because of her violence, but because of her patience. The documentary was never completed. Too many people refused to speak on camera. The filmmaker published an article instead, telling as much of the story as she could piece together. Eleanor's grandchildren grew up knowing only pieces of the story. As adults, They sought the history themselves. One became a lawyer dedicated to ensuring people would have legal options. One became a social worker focused on conditions that produce men like Vernon. Another simply kept the farm. Her grave is simple, a stone with her name and dates. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, though no one knows who brings them. The farmhouse on Sycamore Ridge stands empty now. The burned foundation of the original barn is still visible, overgrown with weeds. If you know where to look, you can find the spot where Daniel Price fell. If you watched this story until the end, it is because something in Eleanor's journey spoke to you. Leave a comment saying I watched until here so I can know who truly connects with these stories. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories. And if you know someone who would appreciate this tale, share this video with them. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories waiting to be told. The mountains remember Eleanor Price, and now so do you.